Thank you, Dr. Spies. I particularly liked your emphasis on the importance of customer choice as we consider LSC models. I know this is certainly a conversation our stakeholders, in particular our Stakeholder Advisory Committee, have been asking us to start, so thank you for that. So next up is our first panel of the day. This session will explore different viewpoints on emerging and evolving roles and responsibilities at the distribution level of the electricity system as DERs proliferate. Oh, nope, sorry, wrong one. Oh no, right one. The panel features Lorenzo Kristov, an electricity system policy and market design consultant, David McFadden of Generation 4 Capital Corporation, and Sanem Sergici of the Brattle Group. Katherine Sparks, Director of Innovation, Research and Development at the IESO, will moderate the panel. Katherine and her team are responsible for driving initiatives in support of grid modernization and the removal of barriers to private sector investment and solutions that support the reliability, adequacy, and affordability of Ontario's electricity supply. Katherine will lead us in this discussion and will introduce our panelists. Katherine, over to you.
Thank you, Carrie, very much. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We know you had a compelling option upstairs, and we appreciate that you've stayed with us down here, where there's also a lot of excitement going on. So we've talked a bit this morning about some of the drivers for DER development in the province. Things like the Industrial Conservation Initiative, past policy efforts, and the reduction in the costs associated with these technologies, and they're becoming increasingly attractive to consumers. So there is a growing discussion in the province, and some of the papers that have been developed by different associations were referenced earlier by Kathleen. But there's a growing discussion around how we might integrate distributed energy resources into Ontario's electricity system in a way that maximizes and optimizes their benefits for consumers and ratepayers and mitigates the potential challenges associated with these emerging technologies. One of the key contributors to that discussion is the recent Energy Transformation Network of Ontario report that was referenced in the discussion guide for today and that Peter referenced earlier. And I believe, as you all know now, the annual report looks at the roles and responsibilities that will be required for distributed energy resources at the distribution level in the future. And I won't get into those too much because I know David's going to touch on those. But things like system operation, procurement, DR ownership, poles and wires ownership. And some of these roles, to some extent, exist today, and many of them are new and novel and will be needed in the future. And so the ATNO report looks at how those functions might be allocated and the potential implications for affordability, reliability, consumer choice, and competition in those options. So we've brought together three incredible panelists, highly experienced individuals who have given a great deal of thought to these issues, how those roles and responsibilities might be allocated. And we're going to talk about the potential implications of those options, as well as understand why there are different perspectives on how those functions might be allocated and how we might come to a reconciliation of those different perspectives here in Ontario for a solution that works for Ontarians given our policy objectives. So without further ado, I want to introduce my esteemed panelists. I'm going to start on the far right with David McFadden. David is president of Generation 4 Capital Corporation. He's also the chair of the board of directors for Toronto Hydro. He's a member of the board of directors for Cricket Energy Holding and vice chair of the Energy Transformation Network of Ontario, so can offer us a unique perspective on that report. And for over 30 years, David was a partner at Gowlings WLG, where he acted for corporations, municipalities, and utilities for the full range of energy considerations and aspects of the energy sector. So welcome, David. Next to David is Sanem Sergici. Sanem is a principal in the Brattle Group's Boston office. She specializes in program design, evaluation, data analytics in the areas of energy efficiency, demand response, smart grids, and time-varying pricing. And Sanem contributed to the development of the New York Reforming the Energy Vision early on. She led the development of a finance model to study incentives required for incorporating and considering the impacts of large numbers of distributed energy resources on utility earnings and rates. So welcome, Sanem. I should add, too, that Sanem has a PhD in applied economics from Northeastern University and a master's in economics from Northeastern, so well-versed in the kinds of issues that we need to consider with regards to the economics of distributed energy resources. And next to me is Lorenzo Kristov. Lorenzo is a consultant in electricity system policy, structure, and market design from 1999 to 2017. Lorenzo was a principal in market design and infrastructure policy at the California System Operator. Prior to his time with IESO, Lorenzo was an energy economist and at the California Energy Commission and a Fulbright scholarship in Indonesia. He's an expert in wholesale market design, DER participation in wholesale markets, the coordination of transmission and distribution system operations. And Lorenzo has a BS in mathematics from Manhattan College, an MS in statistics from North Carolina State University, and a PhD in economics from the University of California, Davis. So an incredible group of individuals to speak with you today. Welcome and thank you again. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to each of you for some opening remarks before we get into our discussion. And David, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Katherine. Well, it's interesting there are 1 million people gathering just near us. But you know, there may be 1 million people up there, but this is where it's really at, right? I mean, this is where it's at. I mean, this conference was a sellout. Can you imagine that? There's a waiting list of people wanting to get in here. I mean, up there, you can just go in the streets and go to that celebration. You don't need a waiting list. You're on a waiting list right now. So probably people out there are up there watching the Raptors because they couldn't get in here. Anyway, it is great, though, to have a gathering like this of leaders from the utility sector, from the corporate sector, from government academia, to look at this subject of where we go from here with the modeling of our energy system in Ontario. ETNO was created over 10 years ago as the Smart Grid Forum, as Peter mentioned at the opening, to develop a vision for smart grid development implementation in Ontario. Now, ETNO, over the years, dealt with a whole myriad of issues and opportunities arising from smart grid. Our last report certainly changes that around, and I don't know how many of you have seen it. The summary of the ETNO report that was just released is available at the desk, or the registration desk. I think with your registration, you'll have been given a link to read the full report, and I commend it to you, particularly for late night reading. But our report examines the variety of options for allocating roles and responsibilities which will be needed at the distribution level as distributed energy proliferates. The goal, of course, I think all of us would have, is that as DER moves ahead, the benefits are maximized, while at the same time minimizing negative impacts in relation to things such as affordability, competition, reliability, or customer choice. Now, there are many similarities, interestingly enough, that seems to have come up, and when we looked at it, between the functions which would have to be done at the distribution level to what is now being carried out at the transmission level. So you think of the IESO at the province, you think of what's happening at the distribution level. For example, distribution system operations. As DERs proliferate, there will be an increasing need to manage multi-directional power flows as electricity is increasingly generated or consumed or stored at the distribution level. So that's number one, and that is not something that we've had till now as a system planning at the distribution level in that regard. Secondly, system planning will be made more complex by the speed and the frequency with which DERs are deployed and are considered as offsets to traditional distribution infrastructure. You're going to have created local markets that haven't existed before, which will enable the buying and selling of electricity services provided by DERs to meet both the system and individual customer needs. So that raises some interesting issues. Options then come up as to how do you allocate out the functions. And there's a spectrum. At the one end, you could see the development of fully integrated utilities that do everything at the distribution level. System planning, obviously wires, even the development of distributed energy resources. On the other side, you could see strictly enforced separation of functions. So, for example, an organization that runs the local market could not own assets that are trying to compete in that market. Now, as you can imagine, the ETNO membership had strongly divided opinions whether existing LDCs should be able to expand their functions. Utilities, of course, felt that they were quite able and should expand right through and operate a fully integrated solution. Non-regulated companies are more concerned about impacts on competition and fair access to local markets. So you've got the two spectrums that are at work, and I think that that would be true of people here in this room today. Now, among the ETNO membership, we agreed on three fundamental principles. One, reliability, affordability, competition, and choice need to drive the policy decisions for any decisions regarding role and responsibility allocation. And I'd particularly put a headlight around affordability, given what we've recently experienced in Ontario. Second, accountabilities for reliability, security, and resilience need to be clearly established. They can't be left up in the air. It's interesting to note that a survey of Ontario consumers indicated their number one concern when they're asked about the electricity system was security and reliability. Second was price. So people are not prepared to sacrifice their system for price. Who wants to have a low price when you don't have any power? Third, we need open standards for connecting distributed generations on our distribution system and open access to any DER markets created in order to prevent the establishment of artificial monopolies that undermine customer value and choice. Now, we think it's a good time to have this discussion in Ontario to start preparing for the future. Firstly, the IESO is moving ahead with its market renewal program, which Peter and others have mentioned. We're just going through the renewal of the Ontario Energy Regulatory System, which will give some added focus to enabling innovation. The Ontario government is committed to new investment in Ontario. And finally, new investors, such as home builders, are showing up on the scene who want to be a part of the energy solutions space. So the ETNO team is really looking forward to getting your input on these ideas today, both in terms of discussions, but also we're going to have a survey which will give you a chance to look at it and give your responses. So thank you very much, Katherine.
Thank you, David. Sanem, I'd like to hear from you.
Thank you. Yeah, ETNO report was really a refreshing synthesis of all the research that's been done on the subject over the years. I quite enjoyed reading the report, and I recommend you do the same. So no one in this room will be surprised to hear that traditional utility business model has been subject to unprecedented disruptions over the past 5 years to a decade. The new aspirations for clean energy, decarbonization, movement towards electrification of transportation, digitalization of the whole economy and its repercussions for the energy sector, and also this increased penetration of distributed energy resources are some of these disruptions. And I'm not necessarily using the word disruption in a negative sense, but these are definitely... Okay, so this is much better, I guess. These are definitely changes to the status quo that needs to be managed. And how the distribution companies and regulators deal with these disruptions really determine whether these disruptions turn into opportunities or further threats to the system. And
while all these things are happening, energy customers are changing and changing their preferences about how they think about energy. They care about their rates, they care about where their power is sourced from, and they are more active participants in this new energy economy. And again, there's a lot of role for the electric distribution companies as well as regulators to how to shape this new environment. And for electric distribution companies, it's really also a question of coexisting with this new reality of the power sector, because as more DERs penetrate in the system, that means that they get to sell less, and that means that they would need to increase their rates to be able to maintain the reliable operations of their system. But then that goes against the affordability question that's at the core of all these conversations that we're having. So these issues are really interlinked. And the way I think about it is that there's definitely a big role for the business model, and Ethno report summarize those models very well. But in my mind, I have these big three categories. The first category is the energy services utility. I think this is Ethno's fully encompassing distribution network model, where utility and distribution company is not only managing the grid operations, but they're also managing the DER market. They can invest in distributed energy resources, so they do it all. They don't sell kilowatt hours. They sell service to their customers. That service includes kilowatt hours as well as other technologies, home energy services, and things like that. So on the other end of the spectrum, there's this wires and poles only company. This model envisions that the electric distribution companies will maintain the distribution grid, will invest in the distribution grid, but they're not going to be dispatching these distributed energy resources. So with that model, though, there are no issues in the electric distribution companies to participate in the DER market. So then, in the middle, there's a model called it's called so many different things, but I like the term smart integrator, or it's called distribution system platform operator, where the distribution company is running this platform. They are responsible for the management of the DER operations. They are the enabler of DER operations. What that means is that they do the dispatch, they do the investments that are required to manage these DER resources. But since they are operating this platform, they don't get to invest in the DER resources, because there is this conflict of provider of the platform also being the provider of the services. And we are all familiar with the access and fairness types of issues. And this model would require, if this model is extended to a electric utility or electric distribution company participation in the DER market, that requires a lot of heavy-handed regulation and oversight. So it's again a question of whether we want to move towards more competition, but on the other hand, introduce more oversight of the market. So with that, I know that we are going to be talking a lot about these issues. I want to share my two overarching principles when we are thinking about these alternative distribution business models. My two overarching principles are very consistent with Ethno's. The first one is, how is the customer best served? Like, which model enables this new desires and preferences that the customer has on the electric system, and whether they are affordable, green, and consistent with their customer preferences. And the second one, it's not necessarily the second important one, is which model ensures the current reliability of the system and even goes beyond the reliability of the system.
I think some important points about customers. Lorenzo, your thoughts?
Okay, thank you. Thank you also for the invitation to participate in this panel. I have to start with a little disclaimer, just to let you all know that I am participating with the consulting company ICF on a project we're doing for IESO, but whatever I say here today is my own personal and professional opinion and not representing the views of the project team or ICF. We all know to a large extent what the context is, that we have a 100-year-old power system model which has essentially been centralized top-down control and one-way power flows across distribution from central stations out to the customer. And this is clearly being disrupted in many ways in a positive way by the current expansion of both utility-scale renewables, which change how the system operates, as well as distributed resources. One of the things that's a factor here that I should mention is this notion of reliability. As David said, customers place reliability as their #1 criterion. But one thing that we're starting to see now is something that's been an industry dream for 20 years, which is the ability to customize reliability at the customer end. That the reliability paradigm that focuses on the macro system and applies, say, a loss of load probability standard, that's basically been associated with an investment regime in which we build infrastructure capacity to meet loads that occur in a small percentage of hours every year. So there's potentially significant cost savings to be realized if we allow this customization of reliability at the customer level, which I think will happen anyway, simply because the technologies are enabling it. In the restructuring that created wholesale markets roughly 20 years or so ago, 25 years ago, that did almost nothing to change the top-down centralized control one-way flow paradigm. It allowed a lot of new third parties into the mix, generators in particular, and retail load-serving entities or retailers at the customer end. But fundamentally, power was still flowing in one direction, and that didn't really change. But now the growth of utility-scale variable resources changes system operation in a particular way that's really important. One of them is the demand for flexibility services. It's really changed from the traditional simply frequency regulation and operating reserves to now where we're concerned with, say, sustained ramping and fast ramping over a period of 2 or 3 hours. The ability to get synthetic inertia and primary frequency response that used to be gotten from thermal generators. How do we get that from inverter-based? And these are all possibilities, but the markets aren't quite set up yet to handle them. Similarly, in wholesale markets, and in California, where I've spent most of my time working in the industry, we see zero marginal prices, zero LMPs happening during a lot of hours, or even negative when there's an excess solar in the middle of the day. Well, if we move to a resource fleet that's a lot more zero marginal cost energy, what does that do to the wholesale market and the value of wholesale market prices? At the grid edge, the fact that all these new technologies are pretty much infinitely scalable. They can be implemented at any size, and we have also control technologies. Besides the resources themselves, the ability to aggregate large numbers and control them as a virtual power plant, the ability to control an entire building, microgrid controllers. This changes the whole spectrum of possibilities down at the customer side. I would add to this then the idea of a behind-the-meter market. We've always thought of the market as being where the kilowatt hours come from or where the megawatt hours come from, a commodity type model. But really, customers don't care about kilowatt hours. They care about the services that they need to perform. They need lighting. They want to run machinery. They want to run agricultural pumps or whatever. All of those services, we're moving into a regime now where the equipment, the technologies, the control systems are changing so much that a market for energy services moves behind the meter. The grid becomes residual supply. This could happen at different rates in different places, but it's indeed a possibility that the technologies are enabling. Furthermore, there's also now a greater concern about resilience. Resilience is the ability to respond quickly, to maintain essential services when a disruption happens. How do we implement resilience to the power system? It's not simply the bulk system, because the impacts of disruptive events are always local. So how do we build that local resilience? That's also becoming a much more important criterion. Finally, I would say that distributed resources really are the first time that we have a really viable alternative to building big infrastructure. I think that's a lot of the big change that the industry is facing right now, to make different choices about what can we do instead of building that big transmission line or that big power plant. And for the most part, the industry is unfortunately polarized, as our world is in many other ways, but polarized around, is it going to be a centralized system and build tons of big infrastructure, or is it going to be a distributed system and don't build big infrastructure? And I think polarization, and in most cases, is really the wrong way to go. You can ensure that nothing gets done if you keep people on one side or the other of a false dichotomy, and I say the future is going to be both. How do we achieve both of them? So I think one of the fundamental questions here is, to what extent does Ontario want to enable a marketplace for third-party providers? Third-party providers of distributed resources, owners of and operators of those resources in the markets, aggregators, providers of behind-the-meter resources in the behind-the-meter market, providers of flexibility services. So expanding the possibility, creating a competitive market landscape for third parties. The alternative is expanding the functional capabilities of existing entities and recovering more of the cost of resources through rate base. Now, I want to say I also think it's a false dichotomy to say we're going to stick with the existing utility model in a high DER world, because whether they own resources or not, they have to increase their functional capabilities to manage a high DER world. So I think that's going to happen anyway. And one consideration when thinking about the alternative models is, how do you want to allocate risks? In an environment where technologies are changing very rapidly, there's risk both of technology performance when new things are being introduced into the market, and there's a risk of technology obsolescence as new things arise to replace them. If we have a competitive marketplace of a lot of third-party providers, more of these risks can be assigned to the developers themselves. If we're recovering things through rate base, the risks are borne by ratepayers. And it's not the only consideration. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that, but that's one of the things that one should think about. So the exercise to do, I think, is to look at the entire supply chain, from the big central bulk power system generators all the way down to end-use customers and behind-the-meter devices, and start to categorize them into what things qualify as what we call natural monopoly, and what things really are best served by being competitive, thinking about risk allocation and also about encouraging innovation. My sense on that is, for the most part, the T&D wire systems and the system operators and even the operators of markets ought to be probably viewed as natural monopolies and regulated as such, subject to open access principles if you want to enable third parties, whereas everything else is potentially competitive. Now, you might decide to bundle some of the potentially competitive activities based on other criteria, and I don't want to pass any judgment on that, and I would say to realize that there may not be a single best solution. You may just be dealing with trade-offs all the way through this process. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Lorenzo. So I think what we'd like to do now is take a quick pulse of the audience to sort of see where your heads are at in terms of the options and the dichotomy that David described, laid out in the UTNO report, between the full creation of fully integrated utilities or full regulated separation of functions. So if you go to slido.com and use the IESO Summit network login, you can get into Slido, and we're going to bring up the polling question. So the question is, can we rely on regulatory frameworks to divide responsibilities for roles like market administration and dispatch from resource ownership, even within the same entity or affiliate? Or should roles and responsibilities be divided among separate, non-related entities? So again, those sort of two extremes of the spectrum, and getting to sort of the faith in the regulatory construct and consumer protection that Sanem mentioned, touched about earlier. So we'll just a few more seconds for voting. If you another 10 seconds. Okay. Cut it off. Interesting. Okay, so let's just see where your heads are at. So 45% divide the roles and responsibilities into separate, non-related entities. So an interesting element to pick up on there in terms of regulation and consumer protection, consumer impacts, and that's where I want to go next. Is as I mentioned, David, you touched on the sort of two ends of the spectrum set out in the Aetna report: establishment of fully integrated utilities, full separation of functions. I'd like each of you to talk about the potential impacts on consumers at each end of the spectrum and maybe in between as you see the options. David, did you want to? I'll start with you.
You know, a number of years ago, for a number of years, I was chairman of the Stakeholders Alliance for Electricity Competition Customer Choice. So that's where I'd be coming from, to be honest with you. So let me declare that right off the bat. I'm going to make the assumption that whatever we do, we're not going to undermine resilience and reliability. Because if that is at stake, then forget it. Nobody's going to support heading into a blackout. So let's assume that that's not on the table. We're not talking about an unreliable system. At that point, then, I think what the customer wants, inevitably, is the best price. So then you're really down to price. Customers don't investigate a lot of detail. What they're concerned about, what do I pay every month? So if what we're talking about in terms of the DERs, generate customer benefit in terms of price, then we've delivered what customers are interested in. If it doesn't, they won't be interested. Mm-hmm. There is another item that I would say is secondary, but nevertheless is in there. It could be related to green, climate change, and the environment. Some people may be prepared to pay a bit more, although it doesn't seem as if they're prepared to pay a lot more for that. I mean, the surveys I've seen, maybe 10% more, perhaps a little more. But unless you have a very zealous person on that spectrum. So I would think that it's price fundamentally. It costs to the consumer, whether it's the industrial consumer or the residential. So to me, that's number one, followed potentially by environmental attributes that people would be concerned about.
Great.
Yeah, so again, we're talking about these two models, one being the distribution company does it all, provides energy services to the customer in this bundle. And the biggest benefit I see with that model is that the distribution companies most of the time are the trusted advisors of the customers. Customers that they serve, they trust them, and whether they're in the market for a new service or could be heating, cooling, in PV or storage, that when they are looking to buy those devices and services, that I think there was a J.D. Power Associates survey. The customers stated that they would still prefer to go through their utilities because they would trust that they would get the best price and service if they engage with their utilities. So I see that as the biggest benefit of this overarching services model. The customer will be working with their utilities to get the services. And another benefit is that this whole DER revolution, I should say, it requires a lot of integrated decision making. So fragmentation in the decision making process can lead to a lot of inefficiencies if there are not mechanisms in place to coordinate those decisions. And given that the whole DER concept is distributed, it's about all the customers, third parties making these independent decisions outside of the system itself, it could be quite a lot of undertaking to coordinate all this planning and decision-making process in a way to lead to optimal solutions for the system. So those are the benefits I see. I mean, on the other hand, the disadvantages could be that utilities space is expanding with this model, that there could be, if not carefully managed, there could be less innovation, less pressure for rates reduction incentives. This whole worry about, whether the utilities will provide information to the DER providers so that they could locate their investments in the best possible places with the system needs, that would need to be managed really carefully. The other end of the spectrum, where the DER market is managed and coordinated by an independent entity, that's really the definition of competition. You let the market forces shape what that market is going to look like, and it's inviting for participation, and it's really the survival of the fittest. Whoever is bringing the best price, best quality is going to make it in that market. So the biggest benefit I see is the implications for innovation as well as the pricing.
Lorenzo, did you want to-
Okay. So thinking about the importance of price and cost to end-use consumers, I would go to the things where I believe the cost impact of greater DERs can be the most significant, one of them being offsetting the need to build expensive infrastructure assets. So one of the things to consider then is, what are the opportunities and the incentives to really get a creative marketplace for non-wires alternatives? If the same entity is doing the planning and earning a rate of return on building expensive assets, then you have a problem that has to be solved, either by separating those functions or by having a regulatory regime that changes the incentive structure. What I see in most planning processes, and this is true in everyone I've looked at, in particular in California, very limited opportunities to consider non-wires alternatives. That's a really underdeveloped area. For the most part, distribution planning is a black box. The state regulators don't have much visibility into it. So that's something that needs to be opened up with transparency and information and opportunities to propose and have accepted non-wires alternatives to big infrastructure. The second one goes to this notion of the behind-the-meter market. And I think one needs to consider, what is the value of the grid in the future, where, say, 5, 10, 15 years from now, customers can decide to meet all their needs with on-site equipment and say goodbye to the grid. If the costs of being part of the grid outweigh the benefits, then we'll have real equity problems on our hands, because it will be the more financially capable and larger customers that are going to leave the grid first and leave the costs of that to everyone else. Well, so what's the reason to stay connected? And I think that's a really important question to explore. I think the reason, one way to look at the reason is, being part of a network means you have opportunities as a participant in that network. In particular, if you can install equipment behind the meter and then be a participant in the market, providing grid services, getting compensated for non-wires alternative, engaging in energy transactions. So creating that kind of a marketplace is also a way to realize customer value and reduced rates without driving some of the more capable customers to defect from the system.
So I want to pick up on that point, because I think that's really interesting in terms of defection and whose job it is to sort of sell the benefits of grid connection, because the risk is huge, right? In terms of people disconnecting and the stranded costs and everyone else picking it up. So maybe I'd put that question to you: whose job is it to sell the benefit? Is that a regulatory thing? Is it a policy thing? Is it up to individual service providers? Lorenzo, can you comment on that?
Well, I think that's really a policy question. You know, that really belongs in the hands of the policymakers and regulators to think about as we move from, so I like to refer to the NERC definition of distribution service, right? And the NERC definition is the distribution service gets power from the bulk power system and delivers it to customers at the other end. So that definition is obsolete. What's the new definition of why we want distribution service? And how do we think about it in network terms? And I think that belongs in the center of the policy discussions.
One of the other things that came up in our pre-discussion, and that I've sort of heard inklings around, is this concern around an expanded role for utilities that involves further expansion of DR ownership. And the concern really is, own DERs, you could put them through the rate base, and then there's potentially consideration of a subsidy versus those resources that would then compete in wholesale markets, for example, right, against non-rate-based assets. I wonder if you could maybe comment on sort of perceptions of fairness there, or how that's been dealt with in other jurisdictions. I think that's of interest to people. Anyone want to jump in on that?
So I can talk a little bit about the New York Rev experience. Going back to the equity issue, I just feel like as market designers and operators and economists, like we really shouldn't be in the business of picking one technology over the other technology. Our job is to provide efficient market price signals and market design so that those individuals, those technology providers, whoever is making the decision, is able to make them on the basis of economics. And there's this whole concept of net energy metering, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, has done amazing service to kickstart the solar PV industry. So now it's become a mature industry, but it's created a lot of cross subsidies within the customer groups, in the sense that customers who do not have the means to invest in solar PVs had to bear the burden of instead of solar PV customers, because they weren't paying their fair share of the system costs. And we recently did an analysis and calculated the extent of these subsidies. And for states like California and for utilities like PG&E and Southern California Edison, those cross subsidies reach to 300, 400 million per year. If you think about it, these are going to apply over a really long time horizon, 20 years. So it's really important to make sure that whatever policy that we are providing is not going to lead to these cross subsidies. And I think New York is in California too, but I'm mostly familiar with New York as I've done a lot of work in the context of REV. They are now moving from this whole NEM concept to a concept called VDR, value of distributed energy resources. It's a value stack approach that values the DER for the value that it generates based on time as well as location. It has capacity value, it has energy value, it has emissions avoidance value, it has avoided distribution capacity value, but most interestingly for me is additional value for distribution avoidance based on where the asset is located. So this is in very congested areas where there's a need for a transformer upgrade or a substation upgrade. If you're locating your DER resource in that pocket, that you're getting additional revenue. So it's again a very well-designed market-based mechanism that not only justifies resources participation and getting revenues from the wholesale market, but also addressing the local distribution problem.
David, I'm interested in your perspective. Lorenzo, I'll come back to you. But
this is really a difficult issue. There's a whole question around energy poverty, theoretically, that there is, and there certainly is in parts of the world. It was in the Hawaii model where the concern there was that only the were well off got off the system, leaving the less well-off people having to bear the cost. And none of us want to see people disadvantaged, and certainly LDCs don't. The issue, though, I think we face realistically is if you take yourself out of the distribution system, this happens in industry after industry. I mean, when wireless came in, people didn't say, well, we got to protect the wire companies, don't allow wireless to come in. When Amazon got launched, they didn't say, well, we've got to preserve shopping centers and all these retailers. The fact is, if technologies become available, distributed technologies, that are good for the consumer, do you think government's going to say, no, you cannot, we're going to bar the entry of that technology in Ontario. We're going to bar, you can't open up a store, you can't install it. It'll be illegal to put, say a battery in your house. There are no batteries in Ontario. We don't allow it. It's not going to happen. It has never happened. It won't happen. So the technology will tend to drive this. The problem we've got to do is to try to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our society are not really thrown on the trash heap. And that includes other things besides the power sector. But to say that we're somehow going to stop technology from coming forward, but distributed or otherwise, is probably not, it doesn't make any sense. That's the King Canute thing, stop the tides from coming in. So I think what we need to do is think this one out clearly. As an industry, we need to look at the technologies as they're evolving and what are their impacts. And that surely is the role of the Ontario government, the OEB, the IESO, and LDCs and so on, to really look at this carefully. But what we don't want to do is beach a whole bunch of people living in poverty or lights out. So, but I think that it's a dream world to say we're going to stop technology from coming into Ontario or any other jurisdiction.
I would add to this question about rate-based technologies competing in the market, picking up on something that Christy was talking about earlier, the FERC policy statement in 2017 that addressed storage as a transmission asset. And specifically, FERC in that policy statement was saying that they are open to the possibility of storage benefiting from multiple revenue streams, one as a rate-based asset getting part of its cost recovery, and then also participating in the energy market and the wholesale market for part of its cost recovery. But the policy statement also said, here are some unsolved problems that we haven't figured out yet about whether it creates a market distortion or whether it violates the independence of the IESO to be the operator of that asset. So in 2018, for almost a whole year, California IESO conducted an initiative on storage as a transmission asset and basically was not able to answer those questions. Where it got to, I mean, the idea was, well, if a developer of a storage asset can get partial rate-based cost recovery and then make market revenues for the rest of its costs, that's going to be a savings to ratepayers. But the problem with that is the IESO could not predict 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road what hours would it give the asset the freedom to say, we don't need you, you can participate in the market now. And the IESO is not willing to predict that because conditions change over time. So the potential investor in that asset had no way to figure out what their potential market revenue stream would be. So we end up with the policy questions that were posed in that policy statement still being unanswered. And I think they're very difficult ones that go to this whole question of stacking services and stacking revenue streams. Very difficult problem.
I want to make sure that we have time at the end for questions, but what I want to do now is go back to Slido again. We're going to pull up another question for the audience. And this time, we're going to make you all system designers. We're going to put you in charge of the electricity sector for a minute, and then I'm going to put my esteemed panelists in charge. But which of the following distribution system models would be the best for Ontario in a high distributed energy resource future? A model wherein LDCs own the distribution system, and then we lay out a number of options for roles and responsibilities for distributors in the future. So if you want to take about a few seconds and weigh in. Love to see what would happen if we put each of you in charge.
Options keep reordering, don't they?
Yeah.
First one is fixed.
Yeah.
Are those all the IESO people? Answering the first question.
I think we're significantly outnumbered, and just because it's our event, don't feel like you have to flatter us. We'll still give you lunch. Okay, so 10 more seconds. I'm going to cut it off. Okay, so I'm going to cut it off. Okay, so interesting. I mean, you had a number of choices, everything from IESO doing administration and dispatch of resources, LDC dispatch at distribution level, allowing LDCs to dispatch and own, separating the functions, and this idea that Lorenzo talked about, a new independent entity handling market admin and dispatch at the distribution level. So, it looks like there's a lot of at least a number of you in the audience, have identified some role for the IESO in the future. And then there's some varying opinions on sort of, and I think that's what you're seeing actually is, what you're seeing is the division of perspectives in the crowd on the role of the LDC, right? Because you look at those bottom three lines and put those together, and so you're seeing there's some varying perspectives on whether the LDC should be able to extend its functions or whether there might need to be some separation of those roles and responsibilities at the local level. That's really what you're seeing there. So I want to turn it over to sort of pass the crown, if you will, now to my panelists and say, what would you do? Where would, given sort of Ontario's starting point, a number of largely municipally owned utilities, number of large clean resources upon which our electricity system is based on. Consumers very interested in affordability, consistently polling as the #1 issue in electricity. How would you move forward in terms of the allocation of roles and responsibilities here in the province? Who'd like to start? It's a big question. Lorenzo, please.
So one thing I noticed there is that B, C, and D are very similar. They all have the LDC enhancing its functionality and doing more, and including dispatching DERs. And if you add up the percentage of those, that's actually the highest total. So there seems to be a lot of sentiment for that. I tend to think, as I started thinking about DERs many years ago now, while working at the IESO, the first priority is the system has to work. That with a large number of DERs, you're changing the direction of power flows, you're changing fault detection and how all of that works, you need to upgrade systems, you need greater visibility, and so on. How do we make sure it works? And I think no matter which option you choose, if there's more DERs, the LDC has to take on new functional capabilities just to maintain a reliable system. So I would start there. How do we do basic operational reliability kinds of functions? What does the LDC need to do to maintain reliable operation with high penetration of DERs? And how does it need to coordinate with the transmission operator when there's DERs participating in the wholesale market? Regardless of who does the dispatch, there's a coordination issue there, because if IESO dispatches a resource, they want some predictability of what they're going to get back from that dispatch. And if they don't know anything about distribution conditions, then they have a greater degree of uncertainty as to what's going to happen. Similarly, the distribution company needs to be aware of that dispatch, because now you've got 200 resources acting in unison responding to a dispatch instruction. What's that going to do to circuit overloads and phase balancing and those kinds of things? So you need to establish that basic coordination, communication relationship. I would start there.
Yeah, I agree with Lorenzo in the sense that visibility is the most important element here, and that coordination. I'm also sort of agnostic to whether it's the IESO or the utility who's doing that coordination effort. The one that I'm not too excited about is that utility taking on this, this role, investing in the DR as well, but then there will be more regulation to have a broader oversight. That I feel like that model could get really tricky and put a lot of emphasis and burden on the shoulders of regulators, because that's a very granular market. Regulating and providing market monitoring for that market is no small undertaking. So as long as that coordination happens, either by the IESO or by the utility, that is again, I think will lead to a desirable outcome. But again, it's the whole DERMS platform that utilities are now trying to establish, and making sure that speaks to their SCADA systems and other grid modernization efforts that are taking place. Utilities are in the middle of coordinating all these efforts, sort of taking a step back from that initiative that is already underway could be a bigger undertaking to just take that away from the utilities and moving it to another organization. And I also think that, I think you would know this better, Lorenzo, but California IESO said that they have no interest in managing the DR operations on behalf of the utility. So it also depends on whether that organization can be found in a jurisdiction to undertake that big task.
Good points. David.
Well, Katherine, I guess I'm sort of where Lorenzo is. It just seems to me that it makes good sense, at least in the short run, and we'll have to see in the long run, that the LDCs would expand into dispatch at a local level. That makes logic, and it doesn't lead to a big increase in cost. Where I think we have is sort of a made-in-Ontario problem is not all LDCs are probably at a sufficient scale to do it. So what do you do with an LDC who may not have the scale to do it? Does the IESO, for example, take on that responsibility in those municipalities that can't do it? Are other LDCs tasked with partnering up? But it seems to me that you can't have a situation where certain municipalities, certain LDCs in certain municipalities are running a full system and essentially getting the benefit of having it done locally, whereas other people can't have it in their system. They don't have the visibility, and economically it might not sense to set up a dispatch system on their own. So I think that's a made-in-Ontario problem. It's not common to every jurisdiction, but it's something that we need to come to grips with, because one group of consumers shouldn't be disadvantaged in this in the event that there's some real benefits, and there will be some real benefits of distributed resources. We just have to find a way to make sure it's available generally across the province, and that's the task. The large utilities, I think I'd let them go and do it, but other issues.
No, I think that's fair. So I'm hearing start with reliability, put that at the center when you're thinking about how we allocate those functions going forward, and the consumer first, and making sure that consumers across the province are protected and that their interests are protected. So I think I want to thank you all for the discussion. This is a great discussion. I had fun up here. I hope you did as well. And I'm confident in saying that our audience definitely learned from this discussion. I think we've got maybe just a couple of minutes where we can take a few questions from the audience, if there are any. I know people are probably keen. Do we have a question? We have a question right over here.
Yeah, hi, John Stewart from the Canadian Nuclear Association. I'm wondering what we know about what drives consumer interest in reliability. Do people see a connection between the structure of the electric power system and reliability? Because I had the impression that for about 10 years, there wasn't much interest in reliability until relatively recently. But my neighbors in Ottawa now are acutely aware of it because we've had floods and tornadoes at the same time for a couple of years. And they've had to pump out their basements for a month at a time, or they've had to cook for a couple of families because their in-laws' house was wrecked by a tornado. So are they seeing a connection to the structure of the power system here? Or are you just getting a generalized concern about weather events?
Well, I would say, for example, in Toronto, that when we had the big ice storm, people suddenly became very aware of what reliability meant. And there hadn't been a storm like that ever. So people weren't ever having to address it. There's no doubt about it, when events occur, people notice it, and that affects opinion and concerns. I would have thought that really right now, there's a heightened level because of climate change and adverse weather and so on, that people are sort of saying, oh boy, are we at risk? And so I think there probably is a heightened concern. But anyway, the fact was, the survey that I read, people were given the choice, reliability, price, and everything, and reliability was up there. And my betting is it's probably a function of, as you've suggested, recent storms and everything, where people are addressing it. If we always had benign weather and everything was 20 degrees and we never had a storm, people probably wouldn't worry about reliability. It wouldn't even come up. But I think because we can see things are changing, I think it leads to people changing their views as to where they want to put their number one priority.
Yeah, I agree with David on this topic, but I wanna step away from reliability and mention something that I wanted to mention before, which is, this whole business model question, we're not going to resolve it overnight. We all know it's a medium to long-term question, but we're obviously not going to wait. and let the DER happen by itself. So one thing that is happening in New York is, regulators are taking a lot of initiative to bridge the gap. While these new business models prove themselves and utility starts acting as a DSO and platform revenues come in, they realize that there's this gap that needs to be bridged. And for utilities to have incentives to enable DERs. And that's really the performance-based regulation with performance incentive metrics. So what they do is they set targets for the distribution companies in terms of their DER integration efforts, and they don't tell or they don't instruct them how to do it. They have these goals. And to the extent that the distribution utility meets those targets, it's DER interconnection, reducing peak demand by X% by a certain year, and that could be through PVs and demand response and all kinds of DERs. And when they meet that goal, they earn additional basis points on top of their ROEs. And this effort is proving to be really productive, and they also have a mechanism for non-wire alternatives for, again, distribution companies to have the incentives to integrate DER, because without those incentives, the market is really not going to flourish. So something to think about in the near term as the role of the regulators to align incentives in terms of DER integration while we figure out the business model problem. It's important.
I would add one thing on the reliability perception question. California, as you know, has experienced some really horribly devastating wildfires in the last couple of years. And so a hot topic right now is the idea of public safety power shutoffs. PSPS is the acronym. In certain instances, the transmission lines have been indicated as perhaps causative in creating sparking that may have led to large fires. And so the idea is, under conditions when it's very dry, when it's very windy, or if there's a malfunction detected, shut down the transmission line. Well, the problem is that everybody who's on the end of that transmission line loses power, and so there's now legislation in California thinking about reinforcing microgrid capabilities in communities that are identified at risk, so that it enables the utility to conduct a public safety power shutoff without those customers being cut off. So I would say having a discussion about resilience, thinking about the factors that cause risks. Many of them will be related to weather change, climate disruption, and how do we protect against those risks? And I think DERs have a huge role to play in that.
Any other questions? All right, well, David, Sanem, and Lorenzo, I'd like to thank you so much for giving us so much to think about in terms of where Ontario goes next in terms of DER integration. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you to the panel. Sorry to have to cut off such an interesting dialogue. I do hope over the lunch hour, if you have questions, that you interact with our panelists and continue the conversation. So with that, we are going to break for lunch. Our commitment is to keep you on time and get you out of here at the end of the day when we said we would. So we will be reconvening at 1 o'clock back in the ballroom. Lunch is served outside, and you can bring your plates back in to eat. So we'll see you at 1. Thank you.
Drunks in the think tanks, go, go, go.